staring at the cracks in the concrete wall. Brad Sigmon knows this will be his last week alive. For more than 2 decades he has lived on death row. But this time there are no more appeals. No more delays. The countdown has begun. Some men go quietly in the end. Some fight until their last breath. But Sigmon? He's chosen his fate. No lethal injection. No electric chair. He will die in front of a firing squad. It's been 15 years since anyone in the US was executed this way. A method so brutal, so final that most states abandoned it long ago. Yet in just days, Sigmon will be strapped to a chair, his chest marked with an X. A group of executioners will line up. 3 rifles loaded with live bullets. 1 with a blank. No one will know who fired the fatal shots. For now, though, he waits. The walls are closing in. The prison hums with a silence that feels different this time. It's the kind of silence that only comes when death is near. Outside, reporters gather. Protesters hold signs. The families of his victims watch the clock. Some say this is justice. Others call it revenge. But Sigmon isn't thinking about any of that. He's thinking about a night long ago. A night soaked in blood. A night that brought him to this very moment. And it all started with a single violent choice. It started with heartbreak. But it ended in blood. Brad Sigmon had loved her. At least that's what he told himself. She was everything to him. But then one day she was gone. She had ended it. Moved on. Left him behind. And in Sigmon's mind, that wasn't something he could accept. He was angry. No, he was furious. And that rage? It didn't fade. It built. It grew. Until, finally, it was too much. On the night of April 27, 2001, Brad Sigmon made a decision. A decision that would send him down a path of no return. He wasn't just going to hurt the woman who broke his heart. He was going to destroy everything connected to her. And that started with her parents. David and Gladys Larke were at home that night. Their house, a quiet, simple place in Greenville, South Carolina, was supposed to be a safe haven. A place of love, of family. But when Brad Sigmon showed up, it became a house of horror. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He forced his way in, a baseball bat clutched in his hands. David Larke, 63 years old, never stood a chance. The first swing came fast, too fast for him to react. Bone cracked. Blood splattered. The second hit was even harder. Gladys Larke, 59, tried to run. Tried to scream. But Sigmon wouldn't let her. He turned on her, the bat swinging again. The sound of impact echoed through the house. Again. And again. And again. By the time it was over, both of them lay lifeless on the floor. Their home, the place where their daughter grew up, was now a crime scene. But for Sigmon it wasn't enough. His rage hadn't burned out yet. There was still one more person he needed to find. His ex-girlfriend. She was the reason for all of this, at least in his twisted mind. She was the one who left. The one who needed to pay. So he left the house behind, blood on his clothes, adrenaline in his veins. He was hunting now. And when he found her, she barely had time to react. Sigmon dragged her into his car. He had a gun. He had a plan. And as he sped off into the night, one thing was clear. He wasn't stopping now. But what he didn't know. The police were already closing in. And soon Brad Sigmon's bloody rampage would come to an end, in a way he never expected. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that brings peace. The kind that weighs heavy, presses down, fills every inch of space. Brad Sigmon sat at the defense table, wearing an orange jumpsuit, shackles tight around his wrists and ankles. He wasn't the same man who had swung that bat in a blind rage. He wasn't the same man who had dragged his ex-girlfriend into his car, thinking he could outrun the law. No. Now he was just a man waiting to hear his fate. Across the room, the families of David and Gladys Larke sat together. Faces hollow, eyes red. They had already lost so much. But today they were here for one thing, justice. The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat. Then he began. He walked the jury through every gruesome detail. The crime scene photos. The blood-splattered walls. The bat still covered in dried, brown stains. He told them about the forensic evidence. The fingerprints, the DNA, the blood trail that led right back to Sigmon. Then came the witnesses. A neighbor who heard screams in the middle of the night but was too scared to look outside. A police officer who described finding the bodies, the way the house smelled of iron and death. A medical examiner who explained in cold, clinical words just how many times Sigmon had swung that bat. And then the one voice that no one in the room could ignore. His ex-girlfriend. The woman he had kidnapped. The woman who had barely escaped with her life. She stood at the witness stand, hands trembling, voice shaking. She looked directly at him. And when she spoke, the entire room held its breath. "I thought I was going to die that night." Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. For the defense, there wasn't much to say. They tried. They told the jury about Sigmon's past, about his troubled childhood, about his struggles with drugs and alcohol. But nothing could erase what he had done. When the jury left the room to decide, they were gone for only 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood. The room was still. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Brad Sigmon, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder." The words hit like a hammer. The families of the victims let out quiet sobs. Sigmon sat still. No reaction. But it wasn't over. The judge still had one more decision to make. The death penalty. The prosecution pushed for it. They called the crime brutal, merciless, beyond forgiveness. The defense begged for life in prison instead. They said Sigmon wasn't a monster, that there was still a human being inside him. But the judge had seen enough. He looked at Sigmon, his face unreadable. And then, in a calm, steady voice, he spoke the words that would decide everything. "This court sentences you to death." It was done. The gavel slammed down. The guards moved in, locking the shackles tighter around Sigmon's wrists. As they led him away, he turned his head slightly. He looked at the families of the people he had murdered. But he said nothing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. The entire state of South Carolina was talking. Some people said justice had been served. Others said it wasn't enough, that a man like Sigmon didn't deserve the easy way out. But there were also voices on the other side. People who didn't believe in the death penalty, who said it wasn't about justice, it was about revenge. Brad Sigmon was locked away. His execution date was set. But what no one knew then was that it would take over 20 years for that sentence to be carried out. And when it finally happened, it wouldn't be by lethal injection. It wouldn't be by electric chair. It would be by firing squad. Brad Sigmon was sentenced to die. The judge had spoken. The gavel had fallen. But death doesn't always come quickly. In South Carolina, execution dates were set and delayed, trapped in an endless legal fight over how the state could legally kill a man. For years, lethal injection had been the standard. It was supposed to be the most humane way. No pain. No suffering. Just sleep. But there was one problem. The drugs were gone. Pharmaceutical companies refused to sell lethal injection drugs to states that used them for executions. South Carolina tried. They searched. They negotiated. But in the end, no company wanted blood on its hands. So the execution stopped. Sigmon sat in his cell. The years passed. 2005, 2010, 2015, his hair grew grayer. His face thinner. He watched as men around him died, one by one. Some from sickness. Some from age. But no one from execution. South Carolina had a death row full of condemned men, but no way to kill them. So the state made a decision. They dusted off the past. They brought back the electric chair. For over a century, the electric chair had been a symbol of death in America. A wooden seat. Metal straps. A cap that sent 2,400 volts of electricity through a man's body until his heart stopped beating. But this wasn't 1950. This wasn't 1980. This was a new era. And the electric chair? Many believed it was nothing more than torture. Sigmon's lawyers fought back. They called it barbaric, cruel, a punishment that belonged in another century. And so the battle began. His execution date was set, then blocked, then set again, then blocked again. The legal war stretched on for years. Then in 2021, the state did something even more shocking. They passed a new law. If a man refused the electric chair, he would face a firing squad instead. 3 shooters. 3 rifles. 1 man strapped to a chair with a target over his heart. It hadn't been used in the U.S. since 2010. Before that, 1996. It was a method reserved for another time. Another world. Yet now, South Carolina was bringing it back. And for Brad Sigmon, the message was clear. The delays were over. The system had finally found a way to kill him. But as his final execution date grew closer, his lawyers made one last desperate move. Death was coming. Brad Sigmon knew it. The courts knew it. The state of South Carolina knew it. But how? That was the final question. Sigmon had a choice. The electric chair or the firing squad. One was a machine built for death. A wooden chair, metal straps, a cap wired to send thousands of volts into his body. The other? A wall, a chair, and 3 men with rifles aiming for his heart. It was a choice no man should ever have to make. And yet, in 2022, Brad Sigmon sat inside his death row cell, weighing two brutal options. The electric chair was terrifying. Men had burned alive in that seat. Their bodies convulsing, flames bursting from their skin. It wasn't always quick. It wasn't always clean. But the firing squad? That was something else entirely. It was old, cold, personal. It was the kind of death you read about in history books. Soldiers lined up at dawn, guns raised, smoke filling the air. The last time America had used it was in 2010. Before that? 1996. Because it wasn't supposed to happen anymore. Not in this country. Yet now, South Carolina was bringing it back. And Brad Sigmon chose it. Maybe he thought it would be faster. Maybe he thought it would be less painful. Or maybe, in some way he thought it was more dignified. But the moment he made his choice, the countdown to death became real. And now, for the first time in over 15 years, the U.S. prepared for an execution by firing squad. But what does that even look like? A man. A chair. A small enclosed room. He's strapped down, arms and legs secured. A black hood is pulled over his head. His chest is bare, exposed. A small white target is pinned right over his heart. Then, on the other side of the room, 3 men step forward. Each one holds a rifle. Each one has a single round. 2 bullets are real. 1 is a blank. No one knows which is which. It's done that way on purpose, to give the shooters a shred of doubt, a way to convince themselves they might not have been the one to take a life. The countdown begins. Ready? Sigmon sits still. No sound. No movement. Aim. The barrels rise. A line of steel, all pointing at a single spot on his chest. Fire. The sound shatters the silence. The bullets tear through the air. Straight into his heart. And then? It's over. That's what was coming. That's what Sigmon had chosen. But outside the prison walls, the world was watching. People were angry. Protests formed outside the courthouse, outside the governor's office. Some called it justice. Others called it a return to the dark ages. They said the state wasn't just killing a man. They were making a spectacle of it. South Carolina hadn't done this in over a century. Why now? Why him? And as the final days of Brad Sigmon's life slipped away, one last question remained. Would the execution really happen? The world outside keeps moving. People wake up, go to work, eat dinner, laugh, sleep. But inside South Carolina's death row, time is standing still. Brad Sigmon is counting down the last hours of his life. The guards move quietly. Their voices are lower, their footsteps softer. There's a strange stillness in the air. This is what happens before an execution. The prison knows it. He knows it. The sun rises over the razor wire fences. It's morning. Maybe his last. He's given fresh clothes. A simple prison jumpsuit. Clean. Pressed. It doesn't matter that in a few hours, it will be covered in blood. And then, the warden asks the question every condemned man is asked before he dies. What do you want for your last meal? This is his final choice. His final act of control. Some men ask for steak and lobster. Some, cheeseburgers. Some, nothing at all. But it's never about the food. It's about one last taste of life. And after the meal? The final requests. Sigmon is allowed to write a letter. A final statement. He can call a loved one. He can pray. He can sit in silence. This is the moment when reality sets in. Some men break down. Some get angry. Some beg. But others? They go quiet. They stop talking. Stop asking. Stop fighting. Because there's nothing left to say. As the minutes tick away, the execution team begins their preparations. The small room where it will happen isn't much bigger than a living room. The walls are bare. The floor is cold. At the center of the room sits a wooden chair. Thick straps for the arms. Thick straps for the legs. And right in front of it? A wall with a small opening, just big enough for 3 rifles to fit through. This is where the shooters will stand. The rifles are carefully selected. 3 weapons. 3 bullets. 2 are real. 1 is a blank. No one knows which is which. And then the final mark is prepared. A red X is drawn over Sigmon's heart. It's not random. It's not symbolic. It's the target. This is where the bullets will hit. This is where his life will end. The stage is set. The chair is waiting. The shooters are ready. And now, in just minutes, Brad Sigmon will take his last steps. Will he walk in on his own? Will he have to be dragged? The world is about to find out. The world is waiting. Inside the prison walls, the countdown continues. The execution chamber is ready. The shooters are chosen. The rifles are prepared. But there's one question no one can answer. Will this execution actually happen? Brad Sigmon sits in his death row cell. The execution order is signed. The state of South Carolina has made its decision. Firing squad. It hasn't been used in over 15 years. The last time the U.S. carried out a death sentence this way, the world watched in shock. Now history is repeating itself. But will Sigmon really face that fate? His lawyers are still fighting. Appeals have been filed. Petitions are circling. The argument? The firing squad is outdated, inhumane, and unnecessary. But for the families of David and Gladys Larke, the victims of Sigmon's brutal attack, justice has already been delayed long enough. They have waited years for this moment. They have watched appeals, reversals, and legal battles drag on. And now they are left with one final question. Will they ever see justice? If the execution moves forward, here's what will happen. Sigmon will be led into a small, cold room. A simple chair sits in the center. Thick straps for his arms, legs, and chest. He will be given a final chance to speak. His last words. His final message to the world. Then the red X will be placed over his heart. The target. The mark. On the other side of the wall, the executioners will take their places. 3 rifles. 2 loaded with real bullets. 1 with a blank. None of them will know who fires the fatal shot. And then the order will be given. Ready? But will the command to fire ever come? The clock is ticking. The execution date has been set, but legal battles continue. For some, this is justice. For others, this is a return to the past. The courts will have the final say. Will Brad Sigmon be the first man in over 15 years to die by firing squad in America? Or will the system stop it at the last moment? For now, the world can only wait. For now, the execution is still looming. The world is watching. The prison is waiting. And Brad Sigmon sits in a cold, gray cell, wondering if the next time that door opens, it will be his last. His fate isn't sealed, not yet. His lawyers are fighting. Activists are protesting. Judges are debating. But the victims' families? They've already made up their minds. They believe justice has been delayed long enough. They want this to happen. And the state of South Carolina? They are ready. The execution chamber is set. The riflemen have been chosen. The firing squad is waiting. But here's the real question. Should it happen? For over 15 years, the firing squad was buried in history, a method too brutal, too outdated for modern America. But now it's back. And Brad Sigmon might be the first of many. So what do you think? Should the firing squad become a legal execution method again? Or is this a step too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. Because this case isn't just about one man. It's about the future of justice in America. And the final decision? Might not be up to the courts. Might be up to you.